Okay, so a very warm welcome to you all to this webinar, which is being jointly hosted today by the GCRF-AFRICAP programme and the Global Food and Environment Institute at the University of Leeds. It's wonderful to see so many people kind of joining virtually. So I'm Stephen Whitfield, one of the lead researchers on the GCRF-AFRICAP programme and an Associate Director of the Global Food and Environment Institute. And I have the pleasure of chairing today's webinar. Just by way of introduction, so the GCRF-AFRICAP programme is funded by the UK Research and Innovation Global Challenges Research Fund. The focus of the programme is on food systems research and capacity building in sub-Saharan Africa. And through this programme, we're working in partnership with local organisations and governments in 4 focal countries. Those are Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania and Zambia. Essentially to create an evidence base and to support policy pathways that promote sustainable development. The Global Food and Environment Institute is an interdisciplinary research institute which brings together expertise in food from across the University of Leeds and our external networks. The Institute has the overall aim of developing enduring solutions that facilitate transformative change and a vision of future food systems which are socially just, climate smart, and enhance the future habitability of the Earth. The theme of today's webinar is Perspectives on Agri-Food System Sustainability in East Africa. And we're going to be introduced to a diverse set of perspectives and case studies. I'm delighted to introduce 3 presentations of research that's being undertaken through the White Rose Social Sciences Doctoral Training Partnership at the Universities of Leeds, Sheffield and York. We're first going to hear from Jose Vega Barbero about his work on power dynamics and governance in the coffee sector. Then from Jonas Cromwell about his work on food waste in avocado production and supply. And finally from Professor Robert Marchant presenting on the interlinked demands for water, food and energy in Zanzibar. Each presentation is going to be about 10 to 15 minutes long and we'll take questions after all 3 presenters have given their presentations. But please do post your questions for any of the presenters or for all of them using the Q&A facility and we'll return to those questions once the presentations have been concluded. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jose, who's going to give us the first presentation.
Okay, so welcome to everyone, and thanks for. I'm really happy to be here and share having this opportunity to share my research with you. And my PhD, so is focusing at power dynamics in governance models across within the coffee sector, and I'm looking at East Africa. So starting with, I would like to give you my starting point and where I'm coming from. And there are significant imbalances in the allocation of power and resource ownership in the context of global production system, which coffee is one of them. And I would like to talk first about one event that actually shaped and massively influenced the evolution of governance across time till now. Was the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement in 1989. And in terms of is gonna shape the, so this is gonna be the existence of a clear group of vulnerable actors identified as the coffee farmers, and also it has it influenced the emergence of a plethora of governance models within the coffee sector. However, regardless the multiple effort of these governance models, still uneven allocation of costs and benefits within the coffee sector are still happening. And I would like to refer to one term coined by Davino and Ponte, and they talk about the coffee paradox. So they talk about the coexistence with the highest benefits that roasters and retailers are currently having, but at the same time, they are coexisting with the really low prices of coffee beans. So in terms of the aim of research objectives, my aim is to examine power dynamics in contrasting governance models in East Africa. And the way I'm intending to do it is through 3 research objectives. The first research objective is looking at investigating governance models. What are the current governance models that are operating in East Africa, and also looking at the main players, what are the main players within each governance models. The second one is looking at those to study power dynamics across those governance models, and looking at what type of power shape the interaction between coffee actors, and what are the outcomes in terms of allocation and cost among those coffee actors. And the last one, the third one, it will be looking to investigate to what extent current governance models can alter existing power dynamics. So looking at whether or not governance models include some mechanisms to alter power dynamics, and what are the constraints or enable factors that such mechanisms might encounter in terms of their implementation. So following with the methodology, I would like to start with the theoretical framework I designed, and it's based and it's formed by 2. So I have 2 primary elements and 2 secondary elements. The main primary elements are the global production network approach, which is going to be used in combination with the power cube developed by Gaventa. And the secondary elements are the filter of legitimacy and the concept of empowerment. So starting with the theoretical, with the primary elements, on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see the global production network approach, how this approach, or how can coffee sector can be seen from this approach. So you have a coffee production net, which is formed by several networks with the variety of these networks are numberless. And I'm looking at cooperative unions due to the strategic point or the strategic place they occupy within the coffee value chain. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the power cube developed by Gaventa, which is formed by 3 dimensions. So the first one, spaces, they are called spaces for engagement, and they refer to the opportunities citizens or individuals have to influence decisions that are gonna affect their own lives. So you have 3 different types of spaces: close, invite, and claim. And also you, on the left hand side of the cube, you got places. And these refer to the arenas where power resides in terms of like social power, economical power, strategic power. From the interactions of places and spaces, the 3rd dimension emerges. You got 3 types of power. So you visible, hidden, and invisible power. Visible power refers to the definable aspects of political powers. So we are talking about formal rules, institutions, or different procedures of decision-making. Hidden power refers to the capacity that some people or institutions have to control who has the capacity, who is invited at the table, who is invited to form part of the decision-making process. And invisible power is concerned with the capacity to influence how individuals see their own place in the world, because some processes of socialization, culture, ideology can perpetuate exclusion, but by setting what is acceptable, normal, or safe. And I'm considering the spaces of engagement governance models are those spaces of engagement citizens or individuals have for, in this case, farmers have for engage. Following with the secondary elements, I'm only interested, and that's why I'm using the filter of legitimacy, I'm only interested in the interactions in which the excess of power leads to unacceptable, improper, or inappropriate outcomes for farmers, which in other words are this uneven allocation of costs and benefits that are still happening. So how, and the other second element is empowerment. And empowerment in this case needs to be, or is delivered through increasing the capacity of farmers to capture and generate value, and also to promoting the effective engagement in the activities of network in which actors function. These mechanisms, they lead us to the empowerment, identify 5 empowerment areas. So actions around those empowerment areas can be designed. So you got social structure, learning, enhancing self-awareness, negotiation skills, and strengthening governance and organization structure. These empowerment areas are gonna give me, are gonna allow me to narrow down and to design or to identify what are the actions that, whether or not I'll be taking to promote empowerment. And then on these slides, I would like to talk to you about the methods and analysis I'm using. And I also link the methods and analysis to the research questions and the theoretical framework element they are related to. So the methods I'm using, they're a mix of qualitative methods, mainly interviews, semi-structured interviews, and some base research based work, which those semi-structured interviews were supposed to be face-to-face, but due to the, the current pandemic we are facing, they might have to go to, most of them, they might have to go to online interviews. And just to finish, I would like to also share with you some of the results identified so far. So I've developed this governance models typology, identifying 5 main type of governance models, starting with the voluntary certification standards, which depends on how they are enforced or what parties are determining are championing those initiatives. You can find governance models and some schemes developed from across the global north, and lately also developed across the global south too. Also, at the bottom of the table, you got the farmer ownership models. In this one, a farmer organization acts as a facilitator to help coffee farmers to go beyond the coffee the production stage of the value chain, so they can have access to other stages where more value can be added. And following solidarity models, for instance, the microfinance, they try to face that or reduce that the lack of access to credit that some farmers encounter. Public-private producer partnerships that involve, they can be permanent or temporary, and they include a different range of actors. And the last one, intellectual property law schemes. And I would like to highlight the geographical indication of origins. So they link some features that any certain coffee has to the geographical location where that coffee is grown to guarantee the quality or to justify the quality of that coffee. And just to finish, I would like to show you some of the impact the coffee impact is having in my PhD. So the scoping trip, my fieldwork has been postponed, attendance of conference, and the way I'm I'm looking at mitigating that strategy. So for instance, all the face-to-face interviews I was supposed to have, they will be most of them online, and also the impossibility of interviewing cooperative unions, most of them they don't have access to internet. There will be I'm trying to identify other actors who work closely with them so they can give me the closest perspective to cooperative unions. And that will be all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jose. So I'd like to hand over now to Jonas.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen, and thank everyone for making it to add. My PhD project is looking at food waste in avocado supply chains. And I'll give a background to the study by avocados, then conceptualization and initial results in the growing processes. So current approaches to food losses and waste tend to focus on downstream side of the supply chain. And in the recent years, there have been calls to focus on upstream supply chain, looking at to losses and waste in the production side. When there have been response to this, the focus has been on quantifying how much is lost, whilst auditing and quantifying in terms of dealing with problem, knowing the causes and how much and where it occurs in the supply chain. What it does is that it doesn't tell us why. And asking why is important because it takes us beyond what is lost and waste into finding the wider social, cultural, structure, and institutional issues that lies behind what is wasted. Understanding food waste from that perspective involves exploring the food itself, not just as its material, but also the people, the flow of actions that takes place within that. And there have been, a number of calls to move beyond the what, how, why to why question, and that is what my PhD is focusing on. In terms of conceptual framing, I draw broadly on Susan Gill's food waste regime concept, which suggests that waste constitute a social relations, and as such, it should be studied as something that is produced materially and conceptually as a social relations. In that, you're able to give attention to social institutions and conventions, which determines what becomes waste and how that is regulated. Now, drawing on that broader concept, I am focusing on how institutions and materiality, the relationship between them and how they shape practices and how that leads to food waste or losses in agriculture production systems. In terms of institutions, I'm looking broadly at the rules, norms, and values, instructions, guidelines, and those comes in the form of, especially in the export sector, it comes in the form of sanitary and phytosanitary rules, food safety rules and regulations, quality standard and certification schemes, and then also norms, customs, and values. In terms of materiality, I'm looking at the wider nature, the environment, the growing environment, what makes an avocado or a plant to be able to grow, and how does that impact on the practice of those institutions and the custom that are formed also interact with that. So looking at the, the framework in its art form, there's one-way determinism among them. There's a kind of a tension in all three pushing together, and particularly institution and materiality will shape the practices that are linked together. For example, in terms of practices are held together by rules and practical understanding, and as that structure how things are supposed to be done. Why avocados in Tanzania? Since 2000, avocado production globally has jumped from over 2 million metric tons to nearly 7 million metric tons in 2018. It's important to know that this figure does not include all countries, because my country, the country that I'm looking at, Tanzania, you will not find it in the FAO statuses, but at least as a broader view of how avocado production has grown over the years. And currently, global growth rate is about 2.3. According to the International Trade Center data, between 2000 and in 2018, 2.5 million tons of avocado were imported at estimated value of 6.3 billion US dollars. And global importation demand is growing at 54% rate. So that gives us a bit of perspective there. In terms of Tanzania, avocados were introduced in the mid-19th centuries. The first recording occurred in the island of Zanzibar in 1892, introduced by the missionaries who then, when moved into the mainland Tanzania, went with the avocado as well as coffee production. So farmers adopted the crop, grew it, but demand, the variety that was introduced was more of the West Indian and then the Mexican variety, which have large fruit sizes, more oil fat and all that. In terms of the development of the domestic supply chain, demand or the supply chain never developed until the mid-1990s and towards the early 2000s. And now in the late, in 2007, the first commercial export farm was established. A new variety was introduced, which is the house variety. And from there, between farmers have been involved in growing the avocado for export. And between that, there has been a number of other establishment that has taken place in terms of pack houses and oil processing companies that has been established to deal with this. In terms of export for Tanzania itself, the export was in 2008, and that has jumped to 9,000 tons in 2009 with an estimated value of 12 million US dollars. So this is a local avocado tree, and that is me during harvesting of the local avocado, and that's me harvesting the export avocado, and those are the trees. So there are two separate, distinct product systems, different varieties, different institutions governing them, different agronomic practices, and artists and consumers as well, because the export variety is not much consumed in the within the local supply chain. Now, with the local production, the local avocado production system is mainly smallholder production. Tree ownership is between 2 and 3, although some people have more, but not more than 6 or so trees on their farm. And the local variety avocados have variety of uses. And this is what some people said about it. In the olden days, the avocados food, but mostly was no use food, but mostly to feed animals, for firewood, for and then people planted it as a hobby. It also provided shade for coffee trees. So it's important to understand the kind of value that was attached to the crop, not considered as food at its introduction. It was later on that people started eating, children started eating first, and then older people and women started, and now everybody else is eating. And that explains why, since it took almost, about 6-7 decades before a trade was able to develop for the local avocado. And understanding this uses, multiple uses, is important in understanding the kind of values that exist. So, and because the local avocado is grown as part of the agroforestry production system in Kilimanjaro region and most of the highlands areas in Tanzania, they practice agroforestry, and Kilimanjaro, where the study took place, agroforestry system is practiced along the slopes of the mountain. So people adopted the avocado as part of that system, and therefore there's that norm and value that has formed. It grows by itself. You don't do anything to it. The cultural perception of avocado as food is considered as butter for dogs. And again, there is no value or no economic value at all attached to the fruit. Because of the natural environment, the biophysical and the climatic conditions that exist in growing areas within Tanzania, that allowed the variety that was introduced, which is also variety that requires very low technology to produce, to thrive. And because of that condition, growing practices that has formed over or has been shaped over the years is that you just plant the seedling and it grows by itself. And I'll just show you what people are saying. So that the local avocado, you do not have to do anything. They grow by themselves. We don't even look after them. They just grow on their own. They fend for themselves. We only take the fruit, but with a new variety, you have to irrigate and take care of them. So the material nature of the avocado itself, in terms of the variety that was introduced, doesn't have much pest. And again, because the production is not on monoculture system, the effect of pest fungus is very reduced. Again, varieties, in terms of impact on appearances, doesn't affect that much as compared to the variety that is grown for the export avocado. But because of the low value and the poor price that is attached to the fruit, and that perception, even though now that the trading is still going on, the practice that has been formed and shaped by the norms and the values and the growing environment is still holding and is still leading to production. In terms of growing, now this has impact on waste. Now, because of the cultural perception of avocado as butter for dogs, and reason for its propagation was left to nature, and that has resulted in a number of inferior quality varieties, which leads to low desired productivity, which is lost to the farmer, and they are maladapted to the domestic market requirement in terms of the varying fruit quality, size, and which affect marketability as well. During the field visit, there were instances where some trees were not harvested. One, because the quality of the fruit, the water content is too high, and therefore if you take it to the market, people will not buy it. Also, varieties that have green skin avocados, when they ripe, the color doesn't change. Depending on the time of the season, those fruits will not be harvested. And then also, even if the fruit is of good quality, but the size is small, again, it wouldn't be harvested. So the practices have impact on the why waste occur at that production level. And because of the cultural perception, the low value that is attached to the fruit, I'm just concentrating on growing practices, but because of the value and the norms that has formed around the historical framing around the fruit, that also affect the harvesting and then the handling practices as well, which is another chapter on its own. The multi-purpose use of the fruit, one for timber and to feed animals, also leads to losses during harvesting, because the tree were grown to achieve timber and for firewood. They are heavily pruned, they are tall and big, and therefore the harvesting process leads to losses, and it's just because of the nature of the tree and how the cultivation practices has led to that, and that is how losses occur within the local avocado production. Now I'll move on to the export avocado. The main variety that is grown is the Hass variety. And we know that within the export market, to be able to grow good avocado, you have to meet strict adherence to institutions in the form of rules, guidelines, instructions, and all the food safety standards that are mediated in the global production system. In terms of the growing itself, why there are a number of smallholders involved in the production is dominated by export company farms, and these are large orchard farms. And then you have outgrowers, commercial outgrowers, and then there are also independent farmers who do not join any of the outgrower scheme at all. And I will look into that later on. Now, just a few examples of the current, in terms of standard and certification that producers have to meet in order to be able to export. And global gap is the main one, especially when it comes to smallholder production. For the commercial farmers and export farms, they meet additional standard. But one of the standards I'll come to the global gap, but one that I want to highlight on which also affect in terms of how production dynamics or growing practices is shaped is the Codex standard for avocados, and then the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe standard for avocados. And that's basically there's a minimum requirement. The avocado should be intact, it should not be affected, it should be clean from pests, free from damage by pests, should have the stock on. There are classes which the produce have to meet, and to meet these classes these classes also determines how the growing is done because of the particular variety of the avocado. Usually at the grading stage, avocados that fall into class 3 would not even leave the pack house, and that is how huge losses happening there at the pack house. But I'm just focusing on the growing. So now the commercial farmers adopt global gap, and to engage the smallholders farmers in, there's an institutional arrangement where farmers are grouped together in the form of cooperative or farmers associations, and that leads to a new institutional arrangement for them. And the certification process is owned by the exporting company, and they centrally manage it through their quality management system. And that quality management system specifies the rules and the guidelines and instructions for planting and for the cultural practices. And those are set out in form of contract for the farmers. So farmers will have to follow those terms and conditions in that contract in order to be able to produce. But it's also interesting to mention that farmers cannot undertake certain practices when it comes to producing because of this relationship that they enter into with the export farmers, and that affect the losses and waste at the production stage. For example, in the northern Tanzania, in that production area, the farmers are not allowed to spray any chemical, no pesticides used, nothing like that. In the south, it's allowed. In the southern highlands, it's allowed. But even that, the water company has to do those practices for the farmers in terms of spraying. I'll come to that. Now, an important thing in producing the avocado is looking at the site selection, and the site selection have to follow global gap criteria, and also take into consideration the avocado, the nature of the avocado, and the and how it goes. You look at the elevation, the climatic condition, the soil condition, and as part of the requirement, they have to do site history and also soil and water analysis. Now, this soil and water analysis helps to determine whether the soil has been contaminated and also to establish in terms of the fertilization and nutrient management regime for them. But the soil and water analysis is expensive. Smallholders farmers can't do that. And therefore, they grow. For example, this is what one export farmer said. And on the export, before it is done, they do the site analysis. And phosphorus is very important. They have to determine the level of pH in that soil. And the pH for optimal production for the avocado is between 5 and 6, between 5 and 7. That's when you have optimal production. And the pH level affect the quality of fruit. It also improves diseases such as root rot, which kills seedlings and even mature trees. So smallholders and medium-scale farmers which cannot afford to treat the land before planting have a lot of losses in terms of seedlings mortality. They have losses in terms of the quality of the fruit that comes because of the low pH level. And we know that in most soils suitable for avocado, are very acidic. They are very acidic, and therefore the pH level needs to be able to rise in order to produce good quality avocado. And the next thing I want to look at, avoid losses is also important about the seedlings and the planting material is used. Now, within the export production, there's kind of two seedlings process that is taking place. And this is what, during an interview with one of the export farms, this is what he said. The variety that is planted is Hass avocado, and the export farmers are able to, in most of their, they imported their seedlings from South Africa, which has well-developed, technology for avocado production. So, for example, in one export farmer, 138 hectares of avocado, all the seedlings were imported from South Africa, and these are cloned seedlings. So they've gone through a lot of processes to get the seedlings, and which ensures that the seedling is free from diseases, is free from pests, and in terms of yield, it gives yield and high quality fruit. Now, to get the smallholders on board, the export farmers produce grafting seedlings. So they just the science from their farm onto the white seedlings, the local avocado seedlings, and sell it to farmers. So although they are growing the same house, the roots and the cores are quite different, and that has impact on the number of losses in terms of infection and disease infection within the smallholder farms as compared to the export farmers. Now, in order to produce good avocado quality fruit, irrigation is very important because it reduces, proper irrigation reduces the disease of potato root disease. It reduces tree mortality and increase yield, and also increase fruit size and quality. But irrigating properly and mulching properly, it has demonstrated that it improves the fruit size, and there are research that has gone on into that. And in fact, talking to farmers, even the smallholder farmers, were able to say that the most important thing to do with this new avocado is irrigating. And this is what, for example, a quote from a technical manager of an export farm, talking about in terms of the quality. In terms of general quality of the crop, I can say our estate has the premium quality, followed by commercial farmers, and the outgrowers quality is on low mark. It is still very low from the standard. Our estate is irrigated by drip irrigation, but for the rest of the farm, none of them has the capacity. So it requires huge investment to be able to put in the kind of irrigation system that is needed, and also the water analysis that has to be done every year. And again, the environment and the altitude at which the avocado is grown also has impact on yield. Environmental factors also comes in. For example, if you're on high altitude, maybe up to about 1,004 meters above sea level, or 1,007 above sea level, with cold temperature, even if you don't irrigate, you can still have some good quality food. But again, there's losses in terms of the yield, the quantum of yield that the farmer can get. And this is what one smallholder farmer said. He said that we have seen the difference between those who follow the instructions, that is following the instructions of growing, that it is enough water, good mulching, and manure. The crop is very good, but without this, you are not going to gain very much. So how these practices are enacted is very important in ensuring reducing losses and waste happens. Now, in terms of fertilization and nutrient management and pest and insect management, also there are rules, regulations, and guidelines that affect how that process is done. But when they are done, it reduces disease and insect pests, it increases yield, and then increase fruit size as well as, and then reduce in terms of and all. Good nutrient management is very important. And in the most common diseases that affect, the most common pests and fungus diseases that affect appearance are the forced modeling coat, which is dominant in sub-Saharan Africa and also in India as well. Fruit flies, black spot, again, is very huge. That leads to rejection and point pepper spot also the same thing. And black spot, for example, is very high in South Africa. Is one of the main causes of fruit not meeting export standard. But in applying the fertilization and pesticides and fungicides, there are rules and regulations that have to be followed. And smallholders farmers cannot afford and cannot in that. And therefore, also because of the contract that they have with export farmers, and because export farmers want to control quality, they don't allow them to spray any chemicals or anything like that. They don't use any artificial fertilizers that I will come to that the export farmers use on their farm. They don't have access to all this. Into losses on medium scale and small scale farmers is just left to what nature is able to provide for them. And again, when you go into the grading, then there's a huge percentage of losses from because of the kind of practices or growing practices that they are allowed and are able to do.
Jonah, sorry to interrupt because this is really fascinating, but I'm going to have to ask you to just wrap up so that we can hand over to Rob, if that's okay. You might need to unmute yourself. Sorry, Jonas.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Yep. So I'm on my last slide now, Stephen. So in terms of fertilization and nutrient, the export avocado requires nutrient and fertilization and pesticides management throughout the production year, throughout the production. This is a model of phenology of what nutrients needs to go into the soil or need to in order to produce good quality fruit. This is a typical year calendar of the nutrient that micronutrient and macronutrient, as well as insecticides and pesticides that apply to an export farm in the year 2018 and 2019 crop year. And it's here I want to emphasize that calcium, for example, affect the appearance of the fruit. So lack of them in the soil will impact on the appearance of the fruit. Smallholders farmers will not have this to do. Avocado producing soils generally lack in boron, and boron affects the amount of root the fruit that the tree can hold. So during flower set during flowering and fruit set, development of the fruit, ensuring that all the 13 nutrients that are required within the soil is supplied either through the leaves or through the irrigation system in order to be able to produce good, perfect fruit that will fit the criteria that is needed. However, in doing all that, they also meet the conditions or the rules or the institutions. They have to do water and soil analysis, which is very expensive, and therefore even Tanzania commercial farmers cannot do. Those that can do are the white-owned export company farms that are able to undertake this water and soil analysis, and they have access to nutrient and input outside Tanzania, because most of this input are not available in Tanzania. Even if they are available, smallholders cannot access them. They are too expensive for them. They can't use them, and therefore this leads to a lot of losses during production. Because of time, I will end here. Probably when questions come, that will give us the opportunity to elaborate on some of the issues. Losses and waste during production is an interplay of forces between institutions, materials, and practices. Understanding this relationship is to improving sustainability and to reduce losses and waste in agricultural production system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonas. Sorry again about the interruption.
Yes, okay.
So let me hand over to Rob. And let me also just remind people, if they do have questions, to post them, please, in the Q&A function. Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jonas. I'll try and be brief so there is time for some Q&A. So clearly I'm not Rebecca, I'm Rob Marchand. Rebecca's one of Rebecca's supervisors, along with Charis Enns from University of Sheffield, University of Manchester. And Rebecca's currently on maternity leave. I'm pleased to say that she had a beautiful baby girl in April. They're all doing well. But she's been working quite tirelessly on a project looking at water, energy, food in Zanzibar, across the Zanzibar archipelago. So we're going to just look at a couple of her research questions, look at the process. Clearly with the maternity leave kicking in, it's very much work in progress. And I'll provide a little bit of an outline of the work that she's done and really look at the next steps, but also look at some of the impressive outputs that she's already made on the project. So essentially she has three broad questions, and it's really trying to understand how communities meet that sort of water, energy, food needs under particularly sort of changing environmental and social conditions. And the environmental are obviously issues around climate change, sea level transitions particularly, salination of water as a result of some of those environmental changes. Social conditions, Zanzibar very much is a rapidly changing island system off the coast of Tanzania. Massive impacts of tourism, population growth, and overseas investments from around the world. We very much look at land use and land cover change and understand some of those environmental social challenges through the lens of land cover. So we are charting how that land cover has changed over the last 20 years, and then using a participatory scenario framework to understand how it's going to change in the next short term, so to 2030, so resonating with the SDGs, Vision 2030 of Tanzania, and the longer term frame, so to 2063, and that sort of resonates with the development agenda of the African Union. So to really look at those alternative pathways to sustainable energy, food, and water security. Before doing this work, really we wanted to, obviously determine our conceptual framework. And when we start to look at those frameworks which are out there, we really understood that there was a bit of a gap in terms of what we wanted to do, and particularly in terms of the role of actors, the role of communities in deciding how their futures, how they're going to respond to these futures around climate, environmental, and social change. And so Rebecca did a really good sort of systematic review of all of the environmental livelihood, resilience, stability literature, and effectively developed this new sort of dynamic environmental livelihood sustainability framework, which is presented here. As I say, I'm going to sort of skip through these slides really so we have a little bit of time for a Q&A. This work led to a publication earlier this year, and this really sort of forms the sort of theoretical framing and the foundations for her sort of empirical part of the PhD. The research approach she's taken is very much around involving communities, involving insights, and using those insights from communities to understand directions of change, understanding drivers of change, and that's historically, but also looking into the future. And I say these two futures of 2030 and a longer future, 2063. And we effectively bring together a whole series of sort of focus groups, community-based workshops, multi-stakeholder workshops involving government actors, overseas development agencies, through a participatory scenario tool, which we developed about 5 or 6 years ago in another project called KSHO. And we're applying this now in a number of projects, looking at a diverse range of things from conservation through to large overseas investments into East Africa. So Rebecca's working on the two main islands of the Zanzibar archipelago, Unguja. She has 5 sites, and also Pemba, where there's also 5 sort of sites. And these sites form essentially the sort of unit of analysis where we have these sort of focal group discussions and workshops. And these are all community-led. One of the great assets, I think, of Rebecca is in her ability to connect with communities. So one of the things she's done essentially goes into communities, works with the Sheha, so this is the sort of administrative lead for each of these villages. That Sheha then will bring in other people from their communities, and again trying to ensure that there's equitable balance in terms of gender, in terms of age. And then they then will explore a series of key questions around social, environmental drivers of change. Then there's a whole series of community-based workshops, which widens out those sort of focal group discussions. Again, just trying to sort of cast that net in sort of ever-increasing circles to bring in those different perspectives from different segments of the community. And then ultimately, we will sort of develop from those workshops, we end up with this sort of series of sort of qualitative and quantitative understandings of change, land use change, drivers of change, and particularly in the context of water, energy, and food. So across the 5 and 5, so 10 workshops in each site, each one probably had about 20 to 30 people. So there's about 200 or so voices in it that underpin the work. And these are the types of outputs from the workshops. You know, understanding the types of change, how they're going to evolve through time, focused on, say, the near future, 2030, and the more distant future. And the idea, of course, is that these will then be used to inform planning, to inform discussions with, say, tour operators, with land use managers across the archipelago. The analysis is ongoing, and this is exactly where we sort of where Rebecca broke in March to go on to maternity leave. And essentially she's completed all of her field work, she's got all of the data, the framework is there, and the sort of thematic analysis of those sort of narratives coming in from the workshops is there in a sort of probably about 90% done sort of manuscript, which will be finalized when Rebecca comes back. And then the outputs will be these sort of maps of future land use for both Zanzibar and Pemba under these two different futures. Just ideas of the next steps. So just to finalize, Rebecca's also been working with a series of side projects during the last couple of years in this project. So looking at marine fishery, so with one of our master students, Georgia, looking at sort of seaweed farming and how that is changing, some of the challenges around that. There's a couple of papers coming out from that now. Rebecca's presented work at the a Joint Research Commission ISPRA conference earlier this year. There's also a side project, particularly looking at medicinal plants and working with natural healers across these communities. There's also a sort of photo map study. There's some, very interestingly, Rebecca had a background in teaching. She was a teacher before she came back into academic research. And she's developed a outreach course on climate and climate change based on some of these insights from her work for her PhD. And that's been delivered in the last few months across schools in Yorkshire. And lastly, we also have been doing a little bit of work with bee farmers up in the tighter hills, just as a bit of a sort of sideline. So it's all very much work in progress. This is the last slide, so we can then sort of move into the Q&A. Yes, so there's also been some articles written for this at the White Rose Doctoral Training Centre, supporting Rebecca's PhD, both around sort of the beekeeping work and the publication that's come from that, but also the language training that Rebecca took before she entered into the PhD program, again supported through the White Rose ESRC Doctoral Training Centre. And that's a very rapid tour of Rebecca's work so far, and happy to take questions or provide further information, clarification as needed. Back to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks for keeping it brief. We might have to have a slightly curtailed Q&A session. There's not too many questions that have come in, but do feel free to raise more if you have them. There is a question that's come in for Jonas about what the motivations are for smallholder farmers to be involved in export production of avocados. And I guess kind of related to that, I'm also interested to know whether you see a kind of difference in the kind of household characteristics of those that do and don't choose to enter into those kind of production activities and supply chains.
Thank you, Jane, for the question. Yeah. Yes, there is no government training and support program available for smallholder farmers. Although I have to say that in 2007, when the grant donor project, there was training in the Southern Highlands on growing the export avocados, and that's by the USAID program with the government of Tanzania. So a few farmers in the Southern Highlands, particularly in Njombe region, were trained in the growing of avocados. And those group of farmers formed the independent farmers, because the avocado was introduced in that area when there wasn't any export avocado establishment in that part of the country. So yes, there is a bit, but it was only at the initial stages. Now there's no kind of national or local or regional programs going on where farmers are trained. Most of the training that is coming is being provided by the export, the ARP scheme. So they visit the farmers and take them through the manual, which contains the do's and the don'ts of how the avocado should be grown, what they have to do and what they need to do. So this field officers act as extension officers. And it's also important to point out that in terms of knowledge and understanding, there is lack of the knowledge and technology growing the export avocado is not with even the extension officers know very about avocado production. So the officers from the export companies, they have been trained, and then they work with the smallholder farmers who signed contract to grow. Now, to come back to your, Stephen, your question on household. Yes, indeed, there are differences in terms of how that goes into the avocado production, because it's high value and more. There are people who are able to take their children to school because of growing the export avocado, able to build both motorcycles and cars, roof their houses. If it's an old house, they have taken the leaves roofs and put more iron sheet on there. So there is differences within households that into the export avocado production. Okay.
Thanks, Jonas. I suspect there's kind of interesting lessons to be learned from your work also for Jose, who's obviously at an earlier stage in his research, but thinking about who is and is not involved in the kind of governance of different supply chains, and what the implications of that are. Jose, I wondered if I could perhaps give you the last word. So I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. Just perhaps reflecting on a bit of what Jonas has seen. What might you kind of anticipate finding in the coffee supply chains in relation to like the social differentiation of which households are and are not kind of involved and active in the governance of that production and supply?
So from the literature I have seen, most of the governance models, they tend to get involved first with those farmers who can afford those certifications costs. So all those farmers that actually need the most of the support, they are left behind. They are left out of the system because, you know, it's where they need to be supported more. And first of all, if they can afford paying for the certification costs, they just left out. So that's what I've seen. Like those who need the most support are those who are not taking part of the within those governance models. In case of fair trade or Rainforest Alliance, all those governance models, all those voluntary certification schemes that require to be certified.
Thank you, Jose. And thank you very much to all the presenters. Lots of interesting work going on. And I'm sure more kind of interesting insights to come out of that work as well. So I'll kind of watch all of those projects with interest going forward. Thank you also very much to Lauren, who's been behind the scenes helping us with technical support. And thank you to everyone that joined from wherever you are around the world. It's a pleasure to have had you on the webinar and to connect with you. So with that, I think I will sign out and say, wish you all a good day.